It was back in 2015 to 16, when I was 15, that my descent into something darker truly began. That was the year I got my first smartphone, and I was obsessed with it. I would spend hours scrolling through social media, losing myself in a world far removed from reality. My mother hated it. She despised how I was always glued to the screen, her frustration bubbling into rage more often than not. One particular winter night, around 1 a.m., I was buried under my blanket, the glow of my phone illuminating the small space around me as I scrolled through Facebook. My mother had strict rules. I wasn't allowed to lock my door at night because she would check on me. That was her way of keeping control, of making sure I obeyed. So I had to be cautious. Then, I heard it. Soft footsteps echoed from the other room. My body went rigid. I immediately assumed it was her. My mother had a habit of catching me in the act, and I knew she wouldn't hesitate to punish me if she found me awake. Fear surged through me, and I quickly shoved my phone aside, squeezing my eyes shut as I remained hidden under the heavy fabric. I knew better than to peek out. She was too perceptive, too cunning. She could always tell when I was faking sleep. The footsteps stopped. Right at my door. I expected the door to creak open, for her to step in and rip the blanket off me in one of her explosive fits of anger. But that never happened. Instead, there was only breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing, as though someone had just sprinted up 6 flights of stairs. My mind rationalized it. It had to be her. She must have been seething with rage, trying to control it before bursting in and catching me red-handed. And yet, something was off. She wasn't moving, wasn't speaking. She was just standing there, breathing in that unnatural way. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. Then 5. My heart pounded against my ribs like a caged animal. The air beneath the blanket grew thick, suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, carefully, I peeked out, expecting to see her silhouetted in the doorway. But there was nothing. The doorway was empty. The breathing was gone. And there had been no footsteps retreating. No sound at all. Dread slithered through my veins as I forced myself to move. I climbed out of bed, my pulse hammering in my ears, and made my way to my mother's room. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the dim glow of the bedside lamp revealed her lying there, completely still. Then she exhaled, loud, grating snores that cut through the silence. She was fast asleep. And then it hit me like a sledgehammer, she had been on sleeping pills lately. My stomach twisted as I turned back toward my room, a cold realization settling over me. There had only been 2 people in that house that night. Me and my mother. And she had been asleep the whole time. I stood frozen in the doorway of my mother's room, my pulse hammering in my ears. The realization pressed down on me like an unbearable weight. If my mother had been asleep the whole time, then who, or what, had been outside my room, breathing so heavily? A shiver raced down my spine. My hands trembled as I turned, stepping cautiously back into the hallway. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, each sound amplified in the thick silence of the house. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any lingering noise, any sign that I wasn't alone. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the howling wind outside. I forced myself to move. Step by step, I approached my bedroom door, dreading what I might find inside. I hesitated before crossing the threshold, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, waiting for me. But my room was just as I had left it, blanket half thrown aside, phone still resting where I had abandoned it in my panic. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavier than before, as if the very atmosphere of the room had changed. My gaze flicked toward the window. It was shut. The door had never opened. There was no logical way for someone to have left without me hearing it. And yet, they were gone. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Sleep was out of the question. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them settled the unease coiling in my stomach. Eventually, exhaustion weighed down on me, and despite my best efforts to stay alert, my eyes slid shut. The next morning, daylight streamed through my window, painting the room in soft gold. I hesitated before getting up, half convinced that the night's events had been a product of my imagination. But as I stepped out into the hallway, the lingering unease remained. I found my mother in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, her expression unreadable. I debated telling her about what had happened, but I knew she would dismiss it, chalking it up to my overactive imagination or an excuse for staying up late. Instead, I simply asked, "Did you get up at all last night?" She looked at me, her brow furrowing. "No." "Why?" I swallowed hard, forcing a casual shrug. "Just thought I heard something." "Probably nothing." She didn't push further, and I let the conversation drop, but my mind refused to let go of it. If it hadn't been her, then there was only one answer: something else had been inside our home that night. Watching me. Breathing in the dark. The thought refused to leave me. That entire day, I felt the presence of something unseen, lurking just out of sight. Every shadow in the house seemed darker, every creak in the floorboards sharper. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen force, pressing down on me like invisible hands. That night, I locked my door. It was a small act of defiance, a desperate attempt to reclaim some sense of security. My mother never allowed me to lock my door, but I couldn't risk leaving myself exposed again. I told myself that whatever had stood outside my room the night before was a figment of my imagination, a trick played by exhaustion and paranoia. But deep down, I knew better. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound felt magnified, every rustling of the wind outside making my pulse spike. I buried myself beneath the blanket, my fingers curled around my phone, as if its dim glow could somehow protect me. Then it happened again. The breathing. It was closer this time. Right outside my door. The air in my lungs turned to ice. It was the same labored, heavy panting, the sound of someone who had run too far, too fast. My grip on my phone tightened as I stared at the sliver of light beneath the door. A shadow passed over it, dark and solid. My stomach twisted. I couldn't move. My limbs felt paralyzed, as though something unseen had taken hold of me, forcing me to stay still, to listen. The breathing continued, ragged and unnatural. Then, the doorknob rattled. A sharp, metallic click as it twisted back and forth. Slowly, methodically, like whoever, or whatever, was outside was testing it, trying to get in. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to scream, to call for my mother, but fear had turned my throat to stone. The rattling grew more insistent, more aggressive, until it suddenly stopped. Silence. Then, the whispering began. Low, unintelligible murmurs, right on the other side of the door. The voice was hoarse, rasping, like someone struggling to form words through ruined vocal cords. My breath hitched, terror flooding every inch of me. I clenched my eyes shut, willing it to go away, to leave me alone. A soft knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I couldn't take it anymore. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking so violently I almost dropped it. With one swift motion, I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the door. The whispering stopped immediately. The shadow outside the door shifted, receding as though it had been burned by the light. The presence lingered for a few more agonizing moments before the breathing faded, the air returning to stillness. I stayed awake until morning, my door locked, my body rigid with fear. When I finally found the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been outside my room. But deep in my gut, I knew the truth. It would come back. The days that followed were worse than the night itself. I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, sent my heart racing. I could feel it, whatever it was, watching. Waiting. It had tested my door, my resolve, and I knew it wasn't finished with me. I refused to tell my mother. She wouldn't understand. She would blame my phone addiction or call it a nightmare, dismissing it as a child's imagination running wild. So, I kept it to myself, carrying the weight of that fear alone. By the third night, the exhaustion had become unbearable. My body screamed for rest, but my mind refused to let go of the lingering terror. I sat up in bed, my phone clutched in my hands, the flashlight icon ready to be turned on at a moment's notice. That was when I heard it again. The breathing. It was different this time. Closer. No longer outside the door but inside the room. A slow, deliberate inhale. A guttural exhale. Right next to me. My body went rigid. I couldn't see it. I couldn't move. But I knew it was there. I felt its presence pressing against me, the air growing unbearably thick, suffocating me in invisible tendrils of darkness. My fingers twitched around my phone, my mind screaming at me to turn on the light. But before I could react, I felt something brush against my cheek. A cold, skeletal touch. A breath so foul it turned my stomach. I snapped. With every ounce of strength I had left, I threw myself out of bed, turned on the flashlight, and spun around to face whatever had been looming over me. There was nothing. Just the empty, suffocating darkness. My door was still locked. My window still shut. But the feeling remained, an overwhelming certainty that I was not alone. I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed my blanket and stormed into my mother's room, throwing myself onto the floor beside her bed like I was 5 years old again. She grumbled in her sleep but didn't wake up. That night, for the first time in days, I managed to sleep. The next morning, I made up my mind. I packed a bag. Told my mother I was going to stay at a friend's house for a few days. She barely questioned it, she had long since given up trying to understand my moods. I left without looking back, without telling her the real reason. And I never stayed in that house again. A week later, my mother called, her voice unusually tense. "Have you been coming back at night?" she asked. My heart plummeted. What? No. Why? She hesitated before answering. Because I've been hearing footsteps outside my door. And last night, I woke up to someone breathing in my room. I hung up without saying a word. I never told her the truth. Never admitted that whatever had been in that house had never wanted me. It had wanted her all along.